So thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Matthew Eby, and I'm the CEO of the nonprofit First Street Foundation, which is also the maker of Risk Factor. And we are here to talk to you today about some significant model enhancements that we've been working on over the past couple years. So as you may know, we have a wildfire model, a flood model, a hurricane wind model, an extreme heat model, and a few others, which we will be coming in the next few months. But today we're talking about our flood V3 enhancements, our wildfire V2 enhancements, as well as some other property data and things of that nature. So with me today is Dr. Ed Kearns and Mike Amadeo. I'll pass it over to Ed to introduce himself.
Sure. Hi, my name is Dr. Ed Kearns. I'm the Chief Data Officer here at First Street. I've been with First Street about 3.5 years now, working on these kinds of projects. My background is in physical oceanography, and I spent a lot of time with NOAA and U.S. Department of Commerce as their Chief Data Officer at the end of my federal career. Mike, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Mike Amadeo. I'm the head of data science at First Street. I've been with First Street for a little over 4 years. Before that, I was practicing civil engineer in the state of California. I worked for large firms like AECOM, as well as smaller firms doing sustainable water resource management work, including flood control and flood infrastructure design. And happy to be here today to talk about our new models. Back to you, Matt.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen. Now, what else could be more exciting than introductions is talking about these actual models. So today we are going to run through our flood model, which is what powers flood factor. So the First Street Foundation flood model, our precipitation model, which some of you heard the updates on in our last webinar. We'll then move into our fire factor and our wildfire model. Then we'll talk a little bit about some property data enhancements that we have through our partnership with Lightbox, and then our roadmap coming up. So what you guys can get excited about that's coming down the pike. And then lastly, we'll hit some Q&A. Some housekeeping items. You should be able to see at the top of or bottom of your screen the chat function, or the Q&A function, I should say, where you can submit questions. At any point, please feel free to drop those in. We'll be monitoring those, and we'll be making sure that they are answered as we go through. Any questions we don't get to, we'll look at to the end and try and answer those as we're going through the webinar. And then after that, we can try and hit as many as we can when we actually send this out. 2 important notes: we are recording this, so we will send this out via email. So anyone who registered for the event will get a recording of the event. And potentially we'll send out the slides if folks are interested in that. So that's it from me. I will pass it over to Ed to get us rolling on our flood factor model and our flood model overall.
Thank you, Matt. So those of you that have been following First Street for the last couple of years know that the first model that we released back in June of 2020 was our flood model. This is the 3rd version, V3. Of that flood model, and I'll be going through what the changes are that you can see in version 3, and what the impacts are on our risk estimates. So the 3 major changes that we've made in the First Street flood model for V3, one is that we've moved to the IPCC, the World Research Climate Program's latest CMIP6 suite of climate models. Talk about that in a second. As Matt mentioned a few minutes ago, that we've been talking about changing of our precipitation model. We're using that as input to this model, so we'll talk about that. And then some of the improvements that we've made with our losses estimates with our partners at ERA. Next, please. So the CMIP6 models, many of you are familiar with the CMIP6 models. This is the current standard of climate models that have been produced by about 100 different climate researcher institutions around the world that have produced these as a very large experiment for this intercomparison project. So it's the current generation of models. Our previous versions, version 1 and version 2 of the flood model, were based upon the old CMIP-5 model. So now we're in lockstep with the rest of the community. If you're not familiar with these models, one of the biggest changes in the models is the fact that there's a new way of looking at the emissions pathways. They're now called shared socioeconomic pathways that capture the changes in the expected changes in the world's economies and impact on carbon emissions over time. So again, this has been talked about on an international stage for many years, and everybody's settled into this approach. So we call them SSPs. In version 1 and version 2, we've talked about the old kind of middle of the road was called the RCP 4.5. Now this is called the SSP 245. So they translate to that. It's still the kind of middle of the road, kind of a conservative estimate of where we're going with emissions. The results that you'll see on risk factor, majority of the ones we'll be talking about today, will be about that emission scenario, the SSP 245, middle of the road. One change that we have made is that we are computing results for other scenarios as well, especially following the Federal Reserve Bank's release of their climate testing scenarios back in January of this year. That's talking about high bound scenarios. We've also started computing for all of our perils alternate pathways as well. So we won't be discussing that much today, but if you are interested in the high bound or other scenarios, please let us know. One of the other changes when we go to CMIP-6 is that the start year of the simulations for that set of climate models is 2015. So our baseline period, for example, for flood now is shifted backwards a little bit. But again, that's something we can easily accommodate. Most importantly is that we are now, as I mentioned, we're in lockstep with the rest of the community. So we're all talking about CMIP-6. The National Climate Assessment is working off CMIP-6 results. Everybody's working off CMIP-6 results. And so we're in good sync with the rest of the community. Next, please. So with regard to the precipitation, which is the biggest change that we're seeing in the flood model, the impacts of a different way of measuring and quantifying the changes in precipitation and the impact on flood. For many years, of course, the scientific community has talked about these changes in precipitation. The data that you're shown here on the right-hand side, this comes from the EPA's Climate Change Indicators website. There have been large changes in the amount of water vapor and how the precipitation's intensity, duration, and frequency has been changing due to climate change. The main reason there, of course, is that the air temperature is getting warmer. Warmer atmosphere can hold more water vapor, and water vapor comes out as precipitation comes out in much more extreme events. So recently, if you've been watching the news or you happen to live in Vermont and New Hampshire, you know that a few weeks ago there was a major flooding event in Vermont. Unfortunately, these types of events have been happening over and over and over again. The FEMA administrator had remarked on this a few weeks ago that we need to start to take better account of this, and so we are. Next, please. So this issue with non-stationarity and precipitation has been discussed a long time. NOAA, the agency I used to work for, has something called Atlas 14, which has been the gold standard for precipitation climatology for quite some time. Also, for quite some time, it's been known that there's some deficiencies in how Atlas 14 is measuring these changes and knowing that it can't capture the climate changes in this. We were very happy to see that Congress had stepped up to the plate and allocated and appropriated money to NOAA to begin work on what they're calling Atlas 15, which takes into account these kinds of precipitation changes. Because this is, the worst case scenario is you're living in an area and you have pluvial flood risk and you're not aware of it, right? And so NOAA's aware of this. NOAA is now starting to work on this. So this is wonderful news. And even just recently, I think last week, a week before last, NOAA Administrator Rick Spinrad testified in front of the Senate that they were going to accelerate the timeline that you see here that they had published, that NOAA had published earlier. And I think they put out a press release just like yesterday saying that, yes, this timeline now is going to be accelerated by a year and a half. So we could expect to see some results as early as 2025. So that's wonderful news. A lot of states require Atlas 14 and now Atlas 15, the no authoritative record to be used in the design of infrastructure projects, for example. However, at First Street, we can't wait a couple years for this information to become available. So we basically computed the same, the new version of the IDF curves ourselves. So we completed that work about a year ago, and we have published this work. So Dr. Jung-Ho Kim, our lead hydrologist here at First Street, had published this work and also had presented it at last year's AGU and AMS national sessions. So this has been well discussed in the community. And so these are the data that we've created that are looking at the new estimates of precipitation intensity, duration, and frequency is being used as inputs to the First Street flood model version 3. And these the way that we created these precipitation estimates follows the same NOAA method that was used in the creation of Atlas 14, but looking at the most recent data, using a subset of the data from some subset of NOAA stations, and handling smoothing and corrections a little bit differently, so we can tease out these very, very important changes in precipitation due to climate change. Next, please.
And one thing I would just add in here, Ed, is one thing that we always care about at First Street is that not only do we peer review the work that we do, or we base things off of the peer review process, but that we're transparent with our methods. So that's a really important part of not only these model updates, but things like the precipitation model that we put in. If you go to, there's a couple questions in the chat, so I just wanted to clarify this. If anyone wants to see the technical methodology documents, they've all been updated on our website as well. So if you go to firststreet.org, under methodology, you can see all of the details that go into this. So not just the precip model as Ed's talking about, but all of these updates that we're talking about today. The technical documentation is all there for you to check out.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. That's a very important point that we are using open science in all of our approaches, because we want everybody to understand that we don't have black boxes. We want everybody to understand exactly what we did and how we've done it, and so you can understand the results. So looking at the differences between the old Atlas 14, which didn't have climate change resolved in it, and the new First Street precipitation model, which does resolve the changes in precipitation, we're seeing some very large areas where a lot of people live. That, like I said in the Vermont example, these are people that are living in an area that they don't know that what was 1 in 100 year an event before climate change is now more like a 1 in 10 year event. So these kinds of events, as we've all experienced or seen in the news, these kinds of heavy precipitation events are happening with much greater frequency. And so we're seeing large changes from the Gulf Coast up through the Ohio Valley, up into the Northeast. And we're also seeing changes out west also too, particularly along the Sierra Nevadas and along the coastlines as well. So these are very, very significant when you're changing from a 1 in 100 year frequency event to a 1 in 10 year event. This is a very, very significant change. So this is what we want to make sure we captured in version 3 of our flood model. Next, please. So resolving this, our flood model, we are modeling at 10 meter resolution, downscaling to 3 meter resolution, so we can resolve street by street, property by property, calculating whether the floodwaters are going to be reaching structures, homes, businesses on those properties. What we're seeing is a large increase in the number of properties over time that are being exposed to. In this case, what we're showing here is the 1 in 100 year flood risk, which is what a lot of people are familiar with. It's kind of the standard that FEMA uses. But what you're seeing with the introduction of the new rainfall component is that you're seeing even more so than you saw in version 2 and version 1, because we did have a rainfall component in there, but was not being driven by the latest estimates as version 3 is. We're seeing even more risk coming out in things like Appalachia, along the Gulf Coast, through the Northeast. So these are significant differences over the next 30 years. We're seeing over 1 million more properties being drawn into this risk category of 1 in 100 year risk over 30 years. So again, we're raising awareness to this, calling attention to this issue, because If you're just going by the FEMA flood zones, you will not be aware that you're under rainfall risk, because the old FEMA flood zones do not capture pluvial flood risk. And so, American communities continue to be surprised by these heavy rainfall events that are resulting in flooding. And we're trying to call out and quantify exactly what that risk is, so people can be prepared and communities can be prepared for this current and growing risk. Next, please. We have worked with an engineering firm called Arup in order to change that flood risk, translate that flood risk into economic losses. So one of the things that we have discovered is this is a great way of communicating climate change risk to the public, as well as to communities and politicians and others, is to take that risk and turn it into dollars, so people can understand the economic impacts of this kind of risk. We do this through our partners at Arup that have a lot of engineering expertise in this area. These engineering first principles to translate the depth of flooding to a structure. It could be a home, it could be a commercial building. They have dozens of different types of archetypes for different kinds of buildings that exist across the US. And they have a lot of data supporting this translation from depth of flooding to the building to the kind of damage that you could expect to have to a residential or commercial structure. And this is what we use to translate from the depth of flooding that we're calculating at the building footprint to the economic losses that could be expected under different return periods due to flood. Next, please.
Yeah, and I think this is just a really good point to highlight here, Ed, with our partners at Arup, this kind of cutting edge theory of this first principles of engineering on how they're able to quantify the damage and downtime with this. So we're not only able to, from our model, look at a 3-meter resolution, so very high resolution at a building level. We can then take all those components of a building, what that building's made up of, whether it's brick or vinyl siding or any of those things, to then understand how much damage it would actually cause. And then almost as important, how long it would take to repair. So knowing what's damaged, how you would actually then go in and fix these things. So pull out the electrical or the drywall and insulation that's damaged, go through all of that and then repair it, and how long the supply chain may take. And all of those things are all in those estimates. So it's a really helpful, not only quantifying the exposure, as it's called, but also the consequences of these events.
Yeah, good point, Matt. And those costs are regionally adjusted as well. Yeah, very important point. So to this point, so this is just an example plot here. One of the other things that we have done for version 3 is change the measurement of the depth of water that is driving these loss estimates. So in version 1 and version 2, we were using the maximum depth of water that would be intersecting, that would be reaching the footprint of a building. So in this plot here, you can see the kind of resolution that we have at 3 meters. Again, we can resolve street by street, property by property. So in these 2 examples here that you see outlined in red, and the one that's in the upper left of the figure, you can see there's a slight amount of water that's reaching one corner of the property. In version 1 and version 2, we're using the maximum depth of water reaching that property and assuming that fills the entire structure. What we're doing in version 3 now is we're using a mean depth of water within around the perimeter of that building to calculate what we expect to be in that building. So we think this is going to be a more accurate measurement, more accurate estimate of the amount of water in the buildings, and thus the total amount of losses expected. It does calibrate better against the known losses across the US as well. So in the lower right or lower center of the figure that you see another red outline, in this case, where you've got the same amount of water surrounding the building, there's going to be no change for that building about how between version 2 and version 3, how the losses are calculated, because it's going to be about the same between the mean and the max in that situation. So again, just if you are using our losses, if you've used version 2 losses, in version 3, there will be a change in how that is calculated. For some buildings, it'll be exactly the same. For others, you'll see a decrease, but we are hopeful that it will be more accurate as well. Next, please. So when we can do this, we can go building by building. So the individual homeowner can go to riskfactor.com and can discover what their risk is today and what it's going to be in 30 years. But we can also aggregate these results across the U.S. In this plot here, this is a county map of these kinds of damages across the U.S. And we're seeing this change in the expected average annual loss. So what we're saying for today in version 3, it's estimated that it's over $61 billion of loss can be expected, but seeing that increase to almost $80 billion in 30 years by 2053. So that's 30% increase in today's dollars due to climate change over the next 30 years. So this is the kind of economic challenge that is facing our nation right now. And as you know, as Congress has written a lot of checks for infrastructure projects across the country, there is hope that these kind of projects could be built to start to defend communities, to start to prepare for this kind of risk and avoid some of these economic consequences in the future. But the first thing you need to do is you need to quantify where the risk is, how severe it is, and be able to understand and inform those projects so they can be built in the right places and protect those communities. Next, please. All right. So that's it for flood for right now. So I will pass it over to Mike Amadeo to go into our fire model. Take it away, Mike.
Great. Thank you very much, Ed. There's been a few questions in the chat that we've been getting to. I do want to, several people have asked, and I do want to just kind of reiterate that this is being recorded. We will share the recording after the event, and this will all be made available. So a few folks have been asking about that and concerned. We just want to make sure we call that out so that everybody knows that that's going to be happening. Great. We'll keep getting some of the flood questions as well that have come in, and as we're talking about fire. So we released our first version of the fire factor model last May, and this year we're releasing version 2. This data is now all available on riskfactor.com. So everything that we're talking about here, you can go to the site and see this updated live. Next slide, please, Matt. So when we built the first version of the model with our partners at the Pyrogens Consortium, we were able to expand wildfire modeling into specific areas that were part of the WUI areas and previously didn't show up in wildfire models. However, we knew there were still many features that we could update to get better predictions and increase our accuracy. What we've done in the last year starts by migrating to CMIP6. So Ed already talked about the climate models. As he mentioned, we're doing this for all of our perils. So hurricane wind was the first one that we released on CMIP6. Now we've gotten flood and fire both onto CMIP6. So that changes some of the future projections in particular. Some of the other major improvements that we've done this year for the model include pyrome-specific calibration, which increases the accuracy and precision in specific areas based on how fires actually happen within the individual pyrome, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that is. And then second, kind of hand in hand with that, is geographically variable suppression, so that we could more accurately represent how each individual fire would spread in a particular area to get to our overall likelihood statistics that we show. And then lastly, just as we've done for flood, we're continuing to update the loss and damage information that we do, that we integrate with our hazard data to create the damages and the loss data and structure vulnerability and all that. So we'll talk a little bit about each one of those. Next slide, please, Matt. And before I get into either one of these, one other thing that we do every year is we update the fuel model based on the fires that happened in the previous season. So if there was a major fire in 2022, we'll take that into account, get the data for that, integrate it into the fuels, because that is going to change the burn behavior or the likelihood that you might see in the following year or moving ahead into the future as those fuels regrow. So that's another major update that we do every year, but we're also going to talk more about some of the methodological changes that influence the difference in our results. Next slide, please. So the Pyrom specific calibration, in the first version, we used historical data to calibrate the fires, but because we didn't have the suppression quite as dialed in as we do now with the geographically variable suppression, we were not able to let fires burn as long as they might. By representing that now, we can get a better representation of how large fires might get, which is what we're looking at in the chart there, and specifically where those are. So that's going to differ from Pyrom to Pyrom. Pyrom is an area of similar fire behavior. So similar to a watershed with flood, the Pyrom represents an area that's somewhat homogeneous in terms of forest cover, terrain, things like that. Fires in there should behave fairly similarly. So that was a major update from version 1 to version 2. And that goes with the suppression, which is on the next slide. So essentially, what the suppression does is it allows us to simulate each individual fire more accurately for how they're influenced by things like roads, fuel breaks, and what sort of activity might be able to happen. What are the availability of firefighting resources? Because the fires are not just burning on their own. There is a human element. There is human activity, and we're trying to get a better representation of how that would impact each individual fire. So at a 30-meter resolution, just like the model is built at, we're able to look at things like the steepness of the terrain. What is the land cover? What's the distance to major roads that there could be fire suppression access from, so that we can adjust how each individual fire is spreading, adjust the rate of spread on the fire front to account for what activities might be beating that back. So now by being able to do this, we can also pair with the calibration against the historic fires a bit better, because we're representing a major activity that influences how fires spread, so that they're not just spreading in the wild on their own. Next slide, please, Matt. So when we look at the impact of this, the biggest impact really is to decrease the likelihood of fires in areas where it's flat terrain, heavily populated, sort of grassy areas where fire could theoretically spread very quickly in the model, but we know that in real life, a lot of these fires are being put out. On the flip side of this, it increases the likelihood in areas of steep terrain and heavy forest, mountainous areas, like especially the Sierra Nevada, where we are going to see a major increase in burn probability compared to the previous version of the model. So again, what this does is it makes it more likely to have fires in the areas where we see them, and less likely where they're easier to put out and we're not expecting so many fires to spread. Next slide. And then the last piece that I'll mention on the changes is an increased calibration of the loss models with our engineering partner, Arrow. So as Ed described in flood, we have specific loss models that apply to many different archetypes of buildings. For flood, what really matters is whether or not you have a basement and what is your first floor height. For fire, what matters a little bit more is maybe your construction material, your roof type, things like that, that influence how likely a house is to ignite and catch fire. And the other thing is the defensible space around the home. How much trees or shrubbery, vegetative cover do you have up against the home? Because that will make fire much more likely to spread. Between the two different versions, we've been able to, especially now that the hazard is calibrated against historic data a bit more, we can now also calibrate our losses a bit better. So in addition to the losses from flames, which we showed some information on that on the website last year, now we're able to incorporate projected losses from embercast, which is how most wildfires spread in the WUI areas and how most structures are lost. So this is a major improvement that we're really excited about. We can give a lot more information, a lot more data to folks in the vulnerable WUI areas. There were some changes to how the model processed the embers and how that it generates that data, which then allows us to better calibrate the loss functions and create a much better package overall with more complete data. This goes to damages and downtime as well. So should there be a fire, what is the likelihood that the home burns down, given the home's characteristics? And then if a home burns down, how likely is it to be, how long will it be till it's replaced? Things like that. Next slide, please. And then so when we get to our sort of final numbers, we're going to be releasing a report that gets into more details on the methodology of the losses, as well as some of the methodological changes of the fire version. Although the hazard methodology is already available on the site, but we're going to be releasing these numbers as part of a report coming up in the next month or two. Where we show this, what we're looking at here is the average expectation per year of structures destroyed. This is not necessarily what is going to happen each year in every area, but more of a long-term average, what you might expect. So we have a lot more data by which to show what is the impact to individual structures and communities from fire. So this is also, so we show about 17,000 properties expected annually, nationally, to burn on average. Right now, we see some years are above this, some years are below this, but over time, this is essentially doubling. So we see a great increase in risk over time as climate conditions change. And that's something that's really important that we want to make sure that we highlight. Next slide, please. And then similarly, we can also put dollar values to that. So looking at the annual losses, the expected losses, we can see how that kind of adds up nationally and what sort of economic impacts you might expect to see from that. So again, we'll see significant improvements or increases over time, where a lot of areas are effectively doubling in terms of the economic losses from wildfire per year. And we'll be releasing again a report that gets into a lot more detail on this, and we're really looking forward to that coming up soon. Risk is definitely concentrated in the the Southwest, but there is unknown risk in other areas too that people don't necessarily think about. So by being able to create this national product, we can show where risk is that is maybe not on people's radar right now. Next slide, please, Matt. So that's everything for fire. As we said, all of this data is available on Risk Factor right now. The other major update that we've done is every year, and sometimes more frequently, we update the property data from our partner Lightbox. Lightbox aggregates county assessor and recorder data. So this is not just the parcel and the building footprint, but also all those property characteristics that are essential for us to create losses. So as we talked about, the presence of a basement, the foundation height, the construction material, the roof material, all that data gets updated every year. We also capture new subdivisions. So if there are new properties in particular areas, we can show that. And I think there was a question in the chat about some of the reports and being available. Yes, this is all available on Risk Factor. So if you go back and search the address, you will find, get back to the property that you saw before. And we'll capture if there's new properties being developed. We'll integrate that with our overall experience. Next slide, please, Matt. And I think I'm handing it back to you. Go ahead, take it away.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks, Mike. And we've been, hopefully my face has been smiling as we've been trying to type vigorously to answer questions. We're at 46 answered and there's still 53 open. So we're doing our best to burn through those, but please be patient with us. So a lot of questions from folks on data access. As I mentioned in a bunch of the questions there, if you have questions, please email us at info@firststreet.org. You can then, we'll have the right person respond with you, whether it's data access, bulk access, API access, whatever it might be. But just all in all, just so everyone's on the same page, there are 3 main ways to access our data. All of this, including this new data that we're talking about today, is integrated into risk factor already. There were some questions for our partners at realtor.com and Redfin and others that all integrate our data to help with that democratization of this climate risk area data. They have all updated their data as well. So that happens simultaneously. If you're looking at scores on Realtor or Redfin, you'll see the same scores that are on risk factor, and all of that's based on this new data. So feel free to go to riskfactor.com and look up any property you want or create an account. The other options are through API. As I mentioned, we have a lot of portal partners or other partners, or large banks, institutional, federal government partners that use our API, or you can also access this through bulk. So similarly, our large partners or research partners or whatever it might be get full bulk data files from us to then be able to look at this information. So lots of ways to access this data overall. And really the four things that we focus on, like Ed was mentioning, one is everything's peer reviewed and we're really open methodology, science methodology around these purpose-built models. We don't use other models to then add them in and downscale them like climate models. We use our purpose-built models and then adjust them for climate change using those climate models. Everything's at a really high resolution so that we can do the climate specific and property specific building characteristics and all of that stuff to tell you what's going on for that individual home, not a generalized area. A lot of data sets that you'll see might be at, a 50-kilometer spatial resolution, or even a 1,000-meter or something like that, a kilometer. That doesn't really help when you're trying to understand what is happening at the individual property level. So everything we do is at a hyper-local resolution to really give us those insights. And then we're able to aggregate outside of that. So you can move past just the property to then say what's happening in that neighborhood, that community, that zip code, that city, whatever it might be. And we have every property and structure available. As Mike was just saying, our partners at Lightbox provide us with data not only around all the parcels, so regardless of whether a building's there, but then if an actual building is there, what are the attributes of that building? And then we're able to do things like figure out the first floor elevation, understand what the damage is to that structure if water to make it past that first floor elevation with our partners at AirUp, and really give you a full understanding of everything. And that's that kind of last thing, is that partnership with AirUp that we have that gives us a full understanding of risk overall. So that's what we try and give everyone through Risk Factor or API or through our bulk products. And in the end, it's really why everyone kind of trusts this data. So whether it's our 30 plus federal agency partners, over half of the $100 billion plus banks, or the institutional investors, or really the everyday American who's seeing this stuff on Realtor.com, on Redfin, everyone's getting the same super high resolution, open and transparent data that lets them know what the risk is today and how it changes into the future. So that's really what we had to talk to you about today. One last thing that we just wanted to give a sneak peek of what's happening. We are hard at work on an air model, an air quality model, as we all have been seeing. The smoke and particulate matter 2.5 this year from the Canadian wildfires has really brought this into our consciousness. And the West Coast has always been dealing this over the last 20 years. There's really been an uptick, especially around kind of the 2016, 2017 period when we've seen this tremendous increase in wildfires. But it's also going to include ozone and other air quality measurements to tell you what is your air quality today, how many days can you expect of certain levels, and then how will that change into the future under these climate scenarios. We're also working on a drought model, which will be available in early 2024 is what that should say. And then finally, we're working on something that we're calling climate implications. More to come on that, but that is really an amalgamation of all these very high resolution models to then understand what's happening at a local level, a city level, statewide level. So that's our near-term roadmap, which you can be excited. More webinars to come, more papers, more methodologies, and all of those great things. But with that, and with 20 minutes left to spare, we can really actually spend some time going through these questions. So I'm just going to start peppering Dr. Kearns and Mr. Amadeo with some questions here. And see what kind of answers we can get for the audience. There's a lot of questions about our flood model, and specifically how we quantify first floor elevation and how that works with risk factor, and whether you're able to adjust characteristics or what that looks like overall. So Ed, do you want to give us a little understanding of how that works?
Sure. So the first floor elevation is estimated from the building characteristics. As Mike was explaining, we've partnered with Lightbox, and we use these data that have been these publicly available data that have been aggregated by Lightbox. That is the information that we have about all the structures. So it comes from public sources. Sometimes those sources do have missing data, and in which case we impute those values using the characteristics of the buildings nearby or within the neighborhood. So we have a reasonable first estimate of what the first floor elevation is. On riskfactor.com, you'll notice that there is a calculator that if you know that the height of your structure, your building, is different from what our estimate is that we've gotten from Lightbox or imputed ourselves, you can change that first floor elevation and see the changes in the losses estimate. So that we're relying on publicly available records. This is usually tax collector and county level information that Lightbox has aggregated and provided to us. So that's our main source.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, Ed, on the on risk factor itself. If you want to change the elevation, you can just see what changes there. This is the same for our wildfire model, our heat model, our hurricane wind model. All of those building characteristics are actually in the experience itself. So if you change something like the direction of the building, we will recalculate the wind loss estimates given that. If you change the defensible space around a property from your wildfire calculations, we will change the likelihood of that building to ignite and potentially be destroyed. And so all of these things are calculated within the experience, making it a very powerful tool. Now, if you're looking at bulk data or those other things, we have the default levels, which we believe is the most accurate, as Ed's saying, from the tax assessors, but we also have the ability to change that if there's another data set that a partner provides us that with other information. So very flexible in that regard. So another kind of question around sticking with flood for a second is around the pluvial model, and would we be able to, with events like that had just unfortunately happened this year, like Vermont, or recent events from years past, like Hurricane Ida, that was mainly a pluvial event through New York. How does our model incorporate those types of historical events or more recent ones that have just happened? Did it actually, predict, I put in quotes, have a similar probability or likelihood that matched up to the what we actually saw within those events?
Mike, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So the precipitation model was built on precipitation observations from 2001 to 2022, I believe. So a lot of those more recent extreme events are in the time series that builds the precipitation estimates. The more recent flooding, like in Vermont, obviously was not included. The data was already published before then. But we've done some estimates and review of that. And of course, we show those events to be much more likely than they would be by looking at the Atlas 14 data. And that makes sense considering we're seeing a lot more of these. So part of the reason that we did this, and the same reason that NOAA is updating the data, is people asking, well, how come I've had 400-year events in the last 5 years? That is necessarily because the likelihood of these events is changing. So that's exactly why we created this and what we did. In terms of showing how we would predict flooding in some of these events, we can then compare against probabilistic estimates. And we do have work on our roadmap in the future to look at some additional validation and measures of uncertainty around overall model performance and comparing them to specific events. So that is something that we want to continue studying and making sure that we're updating our model, not just these sort of events or these sort of updates where we're talking about major methodological changes, but also making sure we've got the most accurate and up-to-date data possible within these. So whether that's looking at the last 20 years of rainfall data, or there was a question about high resolution elevation data, those are the sort of updates and data updates that we want to incorporate into the model. And this is why we continue to make updates and upgrades over time, in addition to major methodological changes.
Yeah, those are good points, Mike. And one question we get asked a lot about recent events is like, is that influencing our results directly? Important distinction here is the way that we're doing the flood and the wildfire models that we're describing today. These are like physically based models where we change the inputs, as Mike was saying, we change the inputs based upon the latest and greatest information that we have. But it allows us to not rely on in a statistical sense, that we're not relying on the most recent occurrence of some kind of disastrous extreme event or something like that. So we can predict the probability of those things happening, but using these deterministic physically based models allows us to have this high resolution that you're seeing in our products, and also allows us to extend these into the future. Again, based upon the best possible inputs that we scale with as we mentioned, with the latest CMIP6 climate outputs.
And Ed, while you're talking about that too, there's a lot of questions around, how do you incorporate, drainage or a levee or some kind of adaptation? Do you mind touching on that for a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think I've answered 3 of those. Once you answer 3, we should talk about it, right? So we've amassed a list of over 23,000 different flood adaptation features across the U.S. So we don't have every flood adaptation features, but we've got most of them. And what we do is we're not simulating the operation of those features. Many of them have gates that open and close, or a levee with a pump system, something like this. But what we are simulating is that they will work up to their design standard. So for example, if a levee and pump system is designed to remove the 1 in 100-year flood from an area, in our model, it will remove the 1 in 100-year flood, and those waters will be dispersed elsewhere. So yes, we have gone to great pains to try to capture these across the U.S. as much as possible. If there is a new feature we have a couple questions about a new feature been installed in your neighborhood, please let us know about these things. We'd love to be able to incorporate them in the next update. So if you're aware, particularly of major ones that protect a whole neighborhood, or a couple blocks or something like that, yes, definitely, please drop us a line. We'd be very happy to learn about those.
Perfect. And so one thing I'm going to just actually show folks, there's a lot of questions on methodology, and I can't access the methodology, or I'm trying to figure out where the documentation is. If you go to firststreet.org and you see up here in our top navigation methodology, you can click on this, which will bring you to our overall models and methodology page. And right at the top is our flood model methodology. So if you click on this, it will give you an overview, and then at the bottom, this button to download the methodology, which will give you the full detailed methodology, and you can see all of the answers to a lot of your questions there. Same thing for wildfire, heat, so on and so forth. So we have all our documentation there for those that are interested in asking questions around how to access that. With that, there's some other questions around for the wildfire model, how we incorporate things like prescribed burns or other treatments that happen within the model. Can you guys kind of elaborate on our updates, our annual updates, how that works, things of that nature?
Yeah, so after every fire season, we work with our partners at Pyrogens to integrate data from NIFC, which is a federal agency that collects data on fires, to get the footprint of the perimeter of the fires that actually occurred, whether that be controlled burns or wildfires. From there, that is then integrated into the fuels model to adjust the fuels that are shown and are allowed to burn. So it might be, essentially that's going to change the fuel model or the density of the fuels so that there is going to be less fuel available to be burning in the next year. We have also looked at what are different fire treatment measures in different parts of the country and included that as well into the original fuels model so that we can show kind of how these are changing over time and what are the impacts of them to to your fire likelihood. So if you go to riskfactor.com, you'll see, just like we call out flood adaptation structures that Ed was describing, we also call out whether or not the county that you're in has recorded controlled burns to show that there is active fire management and preparation going on. So all that data is there too. But that's how it gets into the fuel model, which then the way that the fire hazard model works is that essentially we're lighting many different fires. It's kind of a probabilistic Monte Carlo simulation. And then given the weather and the state of the fuels, that fire can spread. And we model the active suppression, as we were talking about earlier. And so if the fuels are changing, that is going to, because of the controlled burns or because of last year's fires, that is going to change how each fire can then spread, where it might spread, what is the intensity of that fire. And then that gets turned into the overall probabilistic layers that we create most of our outputs from.
Great. Thank you, Mike. And a lot of questions about our flood model versus FEMA. So I see myself as a FEMA zone AE and a flood factor of 1, or I see my flood factor of 9 and FEMA zone X, which means no risk. Ed, do you mind elaborating a little bit on why you would see differences between the FEMA flood maps if they're in an area and the flood factor risk at the property level?
Yes. So the FEMA flood maps were created looking at riverine or fluvial flooding and storm surge. They did not include pluvial, and they don't include the heavy rainfall, nor do they include climate change. So as those maps have been created around the U.S., they're usually negotiated at the local level with the local community to come up with what those maps are going to look like and how they're going to be. And of course there's insurance requirements and regulatory requirements behind this. So a lot of effort goes into those. But the main difference that you'll see between the First Street estimates and FEMA are exactly that we're including the heavy rainfall and we're including climate change. Now, in the community, we've known for a long time that the FEMA flood maps are not capturing risk. It's used for determining the flood insurance rates from the NFIP. That's really the main purpose of those maps, the firms as they're called. But we know that there's a lot of risk outside those zones from flood that aren't realized. And we know this because 40%, over the last bunch of years, and FEMA has testified to this as well, documented this, that 40% of flood claims are coming from outside the FEMA flood zone. So that's kind of like a big red flag. To FEMA's credit, when they, they've realized this too, and they came out with something now called Risk Rating 2.0 that many of you have heard about. Now, the methods behind Risk Rating 2.0 have not been divulged, cannot be divulged contractually. But we know when you look at those rates, and a lot of people are being shocked by how much higher they are, those rates are including heavy rainfall. And so that's why you're seeing a lot of these, the Risk Rating 2.0 rates being rising outside of the FEMA flood zones. So this is something that FEMA is actively involved in, communicating this with the public too. But climate change still isn't in Risk Rating 2.0 yet either. So it's very confusing for the consumer. So when we get questions like this, we understand, and this is one of the reasons that we're going to great pains to try to communicate this risk in a very understandable way, because it is not simple to understand the different FEMA flood zone designations, what that means for you, what the Risk Rating 2.0 insurance rates are meaning for you versus what your actual risk is. So we are applying the same method across the country for every property gets treated the same, and we are laying out the risk in the from 1 to 10 score, and then the expected losses from that risk, so you can understand this, cut through all the other confusion to make it very clear. And if you do have a high risk score on your home, we hope that you do, call your local floodplain manager, find out more about what's going on in your area, find out what the solutions are that you might be able to employ to protect your property. But please, don't be surprised, like for these heavy rainfalls that continue to surprise communities. That is what we're trying to avoid.
Yeah. So one comment, because there's a lot of questions around this on risk factor features. So can we add in multiple scenario analysis? Can we add in download a PDF of the report? Can we add in, those types of features? Lots of great feature requests in here. 100%, we have a big software engineering team and product team that works on this day in and day out. So a lot of those features are coming. We've actually made a significant investment in the growth of that team. So you'll see a lot of new risk factor features coming on a bi-weekly basis, essentially. So every 2 weeks we'll have sprints and we're pushing new features up all the time. So please keep those ideas coming. If you want to see something, drop it in the chat and we can add it to the backlog. And we're always trying to make things as easy for our users as possible. Outside of that, a fun question, and for either of you guys, it's related to flood. Who, in our opinion, is doing a great job with flood management? What city or state or county or whatever it might be is doing a great job at trying to understand what the risks are and prepare for them?
Yeah, there's a number of groups. I think South Carolina has taken a very novel approach just recently and just put out a report. I think it was in June, I think, Matt.
Yeah.
And they were using various data sources, including First Street. So that's why we were talking with South Carolina's Office of Resilience, and they were mapping out where the risk is from different perils, including flood across the state, really raising awareness for the local economies and trying to lay out a plan for the entire state to prepare. So when groups like that are using, they're incorporating climate, they're incorporating today's level of risk and looking forward into the future. These are the kinds of approaches that really make me very excited because this is how, as a country, we're going to build resilient communities in the face of climate change. So over the next 30 years, no matter what we do with carbon policy, that the physical risk that we're going to be facing over the next 20, 30 years is pretty much dialed in already. So there's a level of adaptation and preparedness that we need to start to take action on right away. It's a very urgent issue. And so, yeah, I applaud South Carolina's efforts to do that. Perfect.
We've been talking a lot about flood, and I agree South Carolina is doing a great job. But for wildfire, are we able to include changes in relative humidity and surface wind into our model? There's a more technical, larger portion of that question, but I'll just kind of keep it there if you guys want to answer that.
So the relative humidity is something that we do show the change over time. So really the difference between the current and the future projections of fire risk are based on changes in relative humidity, precipitation, and temperature. And those all kind of go into changing the fuel moisture. We don't adjust the winds over time because there's not a great method by which to do that, or really clear signal exactly on how that would be changing. So we use the same winds today as we do in the future in the individual fire simulations within the model, but it's really the relative humidity, the temperature, and the precipitation that change based on the climate model projections over time.
Yeah, and to Mike's point, this the keeping the winds the same in the current and future projections, one of the things it does, because the fire behavior model, as many of you know, is very, very sensitive to winds, and fire behavior just in general is very, very sensitive to winds. So if we had differences in the wind model or in the wind data that we're using for present and future, looking at the future results, we could be asking ourselves, is that change because of the changes in the winds, or is it these other impacts? And so by maintaining the exact same winds, we've eliminated that as one of the potential sources of change in the future. So to Mike's point, he's absolutely right that the changes are coming through the impact of air temperature and relative humidity on the fuel states, and that is what's changing the probability of fire into the future. So it really helps us focus on how climate is increasing fire risk.
Yeah. Perfect. And with that answer, the next one was going to be on the AMOC slowing down, which why don't we do it, because Ed is an oceanographer. We had a internal meeting about this last week, and Ed was out and he was really disappointed that he didn't get to contribute to the discussion. So Ed, this is your moment to shine on what our thoughts are on this, or how we're going to potentially include this in the model, or anything like that, and we can close it out after that.
Yeah, so many of us did see that recent AMOC paper with a lot of concern. The climate model's ability to resolve this kind of signal is questionable. But looking back, part of what I did my dissertation on in oceanography, and a lot of my colleagues have been working on this for many decades now, is that the variability in the AMOC and deep water formation has been known since the 1960s. A lot of people have been looking for a long time, looking for observational changes to show how quickly this could flip to a different state. And it appears the AMOC appears to be pretty resilient. There's a lot of thermal mass and momentum behind that. It's very difficult to shut off. So we're all kind of looking at these new results and thinking, yeah, we're all interested to see. But I would think the chances of the AMOC actually shutting off quickly is still pretty low. So but it's good to have some optimistic climate change news every now and then. But yeah, the ocean is the giant flywheel in the climate system, and it is very hard to get the ocean to change state. So yeah, stay tuned though. There's still active research for sure.
All right. And now that we have made Ed's day because he got to talk about the topic that he missed last week, we'll close out the webinar there. Thank you so much for attending. If you have questions, please send them to info@firststreet.org. You can see under my name, under my video, I should say, my email. If you have questions, feel free to send something in there and I'll make sure it gets to the right folks. But we appreciate everyone's time. We'll send out this recording as mentioned. It'll go through YouTube, so then you can pass it on to anyone you want to pass that on to, and we'll make the slides available as well. So thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to seeing you next time. And I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. We'll see you later.
Thank you all.
Thank you.